Being in jail gives you a lot of time to reflect on your own stupidity. However, I didn't think about anything other than hatred. I focused on the hatred I felt toward my boss, toward my almost ex-wife Carol, and toward myself for being so foolish. My name is Michael Arnold, and when I say I was foolish, I mean it in capital letters. I was foolish as an oblivious husband who didn't realize his wife was cheating on him, with the person I hated most, my boss, Jacob Sanders. I was also foolish for not knowing that her infidelity led to a pregnancy with his child. Like a fool, I thought the child was mine. I suppose my wife's pregnancy was what drove her to finally say, "Honey, we need to talk." Maybe I should pause for a moment and explain everything. Curiously, my current problems began back in first grade. That's when I met Jacob Sanders. We started first grade together, and ever since then, we've been enemies. He teased me about my freckles. That was the first of many clashes. That fight ended in a draw only because the teacher intervened. My nose was broken, and he ended up with a black eye. During our first 8 years of school, Jacob and I fought an average of 3 times a year, with third grade being the worst, 7 fights that year. By 8th grade, we only had 1 fight, but for a good reason. I gave him a solid beating. I wanted to avoid Jacob at all costs, but he wouldn't leave me alone. For some reason, he was jealous of me and always tried to outdo me. He wanted better grades than me in every class. He excelled in science and literature, while I was better in math and history. In other subjects, we were about even. Jacob was quite good at sports, but I was a little better. However, if I played a sport, Jacob would join it too and try to beat me. As I mentioned, the fight stopped after 8th grade when Jacob realized he couldn't win. From then on, he switched tactics, trying to humiliate me or get me into trouble. He nearly got me expelled and arrested in high school. In my sophomore year, someone broke into the school and spray-painted graffiti in the hallways. The authorities found my student ID next to an empty spray can in a trash bin. The only thing that saved me was that I had reported my ID missing the day before. I knew Jacob was behind it because I had seen him near my locker after practice while I was showering. I decided he was up to no good and checked my locker when I got there. Sure enough, my wallet was missing my ID. I immediately went to the main office and reported it. Another time, Jacob brought a toy that mimicked fart sounds. He placed the device on the desk where I was sitting and activated it. The sound echoed throughout the classroom. Then Jacob pinched his nose and waved his hand, saying, "Mike, what did you eat for lunch?" The class erupted in laughter. I responded with an old saying, "He who smelt it, dealt it." The class laughed even harder, prompting Miss Wormwood to warn us both that if we kept interrupting, we'd end up in detention. Being ridiculed and then scolded by the teacher enraged Jacob. He turned red but said nothing. Beyond his attempts to get me expelled or even arrested, Jacob's relentless efforts to make my life miserable were the most annoying thing about him. Most of the time, I didn't care if he was better than me at something. Aside from the usual teenage insecurities, I was fairly comfortable being myself. There was, however, one area that truly mattered to me: girls. Both Jacob and I were reasonably attractive, but his wealthy family gave him an edge with the girls at school. By junior year, he already had his own car, and not an old junker. His parents bought him a BMW Z4, which cost $50,000. How was I supposed to compete with that? Fortunately, I was attractive enough to get dates. On the other hand, Jacob dated cheerleaders and the most popular girls. I thought they were out of my league anyway, so I didn't care. However, Jacob wasn't satisfied with just his success with the girls. Most of the time, it didn't matter to me because he wasn't in a serious relationship with any of them. So, if they wanted to go out with Jacob, that was fine. However, there was one girl I really liked. Her name was Sandy Springer, smart, funny, and beautiful. When I started dating her, I took her to out-of-the-way places so Jacob wouldn't find out I was interested in her. After a couple of months of dating, we decided to make it official. I thought if Sandy wore my ring, it would be a sure thing. Remember how I mentioned I'm not the brightest? Well, I proved it again in this case. Prom was approaching, and I assumed Sandy and I would go together. I should have asked her immediately, but I'm not sure it would have made a difference. Anyway, after I bought the tickets, I casually mentioned it during lunch. She blushed and told me she had accepted Jacob's invitation to go with him. I demanded my ring back and got it. Then I left Sandy crying in the cafeteria and never spoke to her again. I was so angry with Sandy, I felt like tearing someone's head off. Instead, I saw Pam Taylor, the captain of the cheerleading team and Jacob's supposed girlfriend. Under normal circumstances, I would never have dared approach her. "Hi, Pam," I said cheerfully. "How are you?" "I'm fine." "And you, Michael?" Pam replied. She was amazing but never arrogant. "I'm good," I said, thinking I had nothing to lose. "Tell me, would you like to go to prom with me?" "That's very kind of you to ask," she said politely, "but I'm going with Jacob." Oh, I feigned ignorance. I must have misunderstood because I just heard Jacob invited Sandy Springer. I must have gotten confused. Anyway, forget I said anything. I left Pam confused and talking to herself. Later, I heard she and Jacob had a huge fight. Maybe Jacob had stolen Sandy from me, but I ruined his romance with Pam. It wasn't entirely satisfying, but it was better than nothing. However, later that day, things got much better. "Michael." Pam called out as I was leaving school. "Hi, Pam," I said, still pretending innocence. "I'm sorry if I upset you earlier," she began. "Don't worry about it, Pam," I replied, trying to act casual. "Stop it, Michael," she said firmly. "I found out you were dating Sandy, and that jerk Jacob stole your girlfriend." My ears burned. I'd been caught. "Yeah. I'm sorry. I was just trying to get back at Jacob. I didn't mean for you to get caught up in it." "Were you serious about taking me to prom?" she asked. "It doesn't matter," I began. "Forget about it." "No, I'd love to go with you," she said. "I want to get even too." Prom night turned out to be an unforgettable event for me. Not only did I take the most beautiful girl in school, but I also made her feel like a princess. Pam was by my side the entire time. I enjoyed watching the expressions on the faces of the other guys. They couldn't believe she was with me. I don't know what Jacob thought would happen, but it definitely wasn't this. His eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw us walk into the gym. He tried to come between Pam and me and even asked her to leave me and sit at his table. Pam refused. He asked her to dance many times, but Pam didn't give him the slightest attention. I felt bad for Sandy because she realized Jacob had been using her. Sandy finally stopped crying and asked her parents to pick her up. I still feel a little guilty about that, but it was her decision, and she had to live with it. After the dance, Jacob kept trying to win Pam back. I was smart enough to realize I was playing the role of Cinderella and that by Monday, Pam would probably go back to Jacob. But that night, I played my role the best I could. That brought me to a local motel, where I spent time with the most beautiful girl in school. When I left Pam, she gave me a big kiss and told me what a great guy I was. I went home floating on cloud 9. But as I expected, by the following Monday, Pam and Jacob were back together. Still, every time Jacob walked past me in the hallway, I gave him a smug smile. Graduation arrived, and most of us headed off to the universities we had chosen. I was sad to leave my hometown and scared of the unknown, but I wasn't upset about leaving Jacob behind forever, or so I thought. I was accepted to Georgia Tech, while Jacob went to Harvard. Of course, he went to Harvard. There was even a building named after his grandfather. I did well at Georgia Tech, majoring in software engineering. I met Carol at a party during my first year in engineering school. I won't bore you with the details of how we became friends, fell in love, and got married. To be honest, I think we were more like very good friends than true lovers at first. Either way, our story wasn't particularly memorable, and none of that matters now. I'll say this about Carol: she was smart. She studied business at the University of Georgia. I liked her because she wasn't just intelligent, she was also funny and very kind. Carol wasn't super attractive, pretty in that girl next door kind of way. Honestly, Carol couldn't hold a candle to Pam, but she was as pretty as Sandy. For some reason, we got along well right from the start. We got married 3 months after graduating from college, and 5 years into our marriage, I thought we were pretty happy. Although we were more like friends than lovers, by our 3rd year of marriage, I was completely in love with Carol, and I believe she felt the same about me. We even talked about starting a family. Little did I know my wife was in a hurry and had started without me. Right after graduating, I landed a job at AB, an emerging software security company. I graduated with honors, so I had plenty of job offers. 2 brothers sold me on the idea of living modestly and making a fortune through the company. Don't get me wrong, the company did really well. It thrived, and we delivered quality work for several large corporations. Plus, I earned a 6-figure salary. Our work involved finding and fixing security vulnerabilities in corporate software. Our reputation grew. But then the brothers decided to sell the company. To my surprise, we were acquired by a much larger firm, and that's when my troubles began. About 3 years into my time at AB, Carol decided she wanted a new job. It so happened that the larger firm was looking for an office manager. Carol applied and got the position. I was a little concerned about us working at the same company, but at first, everything worked out fine. We used to take the bus together and have lunch together. We worked in completely different departments and areas, so we rarely saw each other during the day. We'd go to work together, share a kiss, and then head to our respective departments. If we both had free time, most days, we'd have lunch together and then head home together at the end of the day. Things were going well until everything fell apart. Before I tell you about the acquisition, let me explain my department. I was a senior programmer, which meant I worked on projects independently and managed the work schedules of the 8 programmers who reported to me. My main responsibility was solving any problems my team couldn't handle on their own. Fortunately, there weren't many, which meant our clients were very satisfied. Our workspace was about half the size of a basketball court. We called it the bullpen. We mostly worked standing at tables. The room was packed with all kinds of computers, servers, interfaces, and printers. We had almost every piece of computer equipment you could dream of. We prided ourselves on making our clients' systems as secure as possible. In my 5 years at the company, we only had one complaint about a compromised system. We traced the attack to an employee at the same company. The hacker disabled most of the software we had installed. That employee wasn't very smart, but he really gave us a sleepless night. Besides us, we had an administrative assistant, Kimberly. She was like our go-to person for everything. Kimberly handled correspondence and memos, kept track of supplies, and ensured we never ran out of anything. She also prepared our monthly reports and tracked billable hours precisely. At the start, most of our work was done with pencil and paper. This gave programmers an overview before typing anything into the computer. Somehow, Kimberly managed to decipher everyone's handwriting and organized the notes for our files. Although it wasn't part of her job description, Kimberly also made the best coffee for us every morning. Kimberly was around 23 or 24 years old, according to my calculations. She had short blonde hair, deep brown eyes, and a very pretty face. However, she was about 50 pounds overweight. Considering Kimberly was only 5 feet 5 inches tall, that extra weight was significant. Although she had a pretty face, her large belly and backside immediately ruined the overall image. I knew Kimberly was sensitive about her weight because she always talked about how fat she was. I felt uncomfortable whenever she brought it up, but I understood it was her defense mechanism. For me, the only thing that mattered was that Kimberly did her job well and was a valuable asset to my team. The news that the company had been sold hit us like a bucket of cold water. The two brothers didn't even have the courage to tell the employees in person. They had their lawyer make the announcement. I was furious because all the stock options the brothers had promised us when the company went public disappeared with that announcement. I didn't know what to do about this change. Carol was just as upset and confused as I was, but she was the one who convinced me to stay the course and see what the new owners would do. The new management sent a senior vice president to oversee the transition. At first, he focused on the main office. When I joined the company, the number of employees had grown from 5 to more than 150. From what I heard, the person from the new corporate headquarters would start in the accounting department and then work their way through the rest of the company. Within 2 days, I found out that the senior vice president in charge of reviewing the security software wasn't just anyone, it was Jacob Sanders. At the same time, I also learned that Jacob was leading the transition process. Additionally, I heard that our salaries would be adjusted to match those of the parent company. My salary would increase by $5,000, and Carol's by $15,000. My internal alarm was telling me I should run, not walk, to the nearest exit. However, Carol convinced me it would be crazy to leave our current jobs, especially after the pay raise. She also pointed out that Jacob would only be around for 6 months at most before moving on. The first change came when they hired 4 new programmers and assigned them to the bullpen. Of course, they were all Harvard graduates, but none of them were even a tenth as good as anyone on my current team. Not only were they poor programmers, but they were also arrogant and had an inflated sense of entitlement. The 4 immediately started bullying Kimberly, sometimes privately, other times openly and maliciously. I tried advising them, pointing out that their behavior was unacceptable. However, they didn't stop. Instead, they targeted Kimberly when they thought I wasn't around. Finally, I called the 4 into the conference room and gave them a stern warning. They left with empty promises to improve, but I could tell they weren't going to change. No one on my team liked them, and they caused more harm than good with their work. Eventually, I decided I wanted them gone. Unfortunately, I didn't have the authority to fire them because Jacob had hired them. I knew that if I demanded their dismissal, Jacob would simply ignore me. I also knew Kimberly got up early every day to make coffee and prepare the office. Since reprimanding the 4 troublemakers about their treatment of Kimberly, I noticed they all started arriving earlier. I eventually realized they were using the time before my arrival to torment her. I could see Kimberly was reaching her breaking point and would likely quit. I also knew she loved working at the company and needed the job. So, I decided to arrive early and catch them in the act. I hid in a supply closet near our small kitchen, with my phone ready. As expected, Kimberly arrived and started making coffee. A few minutes later, the 4 troublemakers showed up, and the harassment began. "Hey, Grease Bucket," Ted, the leader of the group, said with a smirk aimed at Kimberly. "Show us your secret spot," added Fred, another of the group. "I want to see it," the other 2 chimed in. I saw tears rolling down Kimberly's face, and I couldn't take it anymore. I had more than enough evidence. I stepped out of the supply closet. "You 4, pack your things and leave," I said firmly. "You can't fire us," Ted shot back. "Only Jacob can fire us." "That's true," I replied with a malicious smile. "But I have proof that you harassed Kimberly. So let me explain your options. You can either resign immediately, or I'll take this video to the police. The choice is yours. Resign, and I won't call the police. I'm giving you 15 minutes to decide. You can even run to Jacob if you want, but I'm sure he won't risk his position for the likes of you." 15 minutes later, I had their resignations in hand, and all 4 of them were gone. Kimberly's face showed immense relief and gratitude. I called her to my desk after the four had left. "I'm so sorry for what those four put you through," I said. "I should have acted sooner. If anything like this ever happens again, promise me you'll come to me immediately. You're a wonderful person, and those four are nothing but scum." Kimberly sobbed softly and thanked me for protecting her. I told her it was part of my job, though I admitted I hadn't done it very well since she had to endure those idiots for too long. "Mr. Arnold, you have no idea how much this means to me," she said, holding back tears. "I was about to quit, but I didn't know what I'd do without this job. I wasn't sure if I'd find another one as good. Kimberly, I'm so sorry you had to go through this. I see you're upset. If you want to take the rest of the day off, I'll make sure it doesn't count as a personal or sick day." "Thank you, Mr. Arnold. But I'd rather stay here and work." After that day, Kimberly seemed to go out of her way to help me with anything I needed. I tried to tell her I was just doing my job, but she kept insisting I had gone above and beyond for her. Not long after, I was called to Jacob's office. As soon as I stepped inside, he demanded, "I want those programmers rehired." "That's not going to happen," I replied firmly. "I have proof that those four harassed and abused our administrative assistant. If you want to rehire them, go ahead, but I guarantee there will be lawsuits against all four of them, the parent company, and you. I don't think your bosses will appreciate that." Jacob glared at me furiously but then forced a smile and backed down. He tried to pretend he didn't know all the details, but that night I realized he had been lying. That evening, Carol came home and criticized me for being antagonistic toward Jacob. She thought I was an idiot for threatening our boss. Looking back, I should have realized what Jacob was planning because my gut instinct was screaming, danger. But when everything returned to normal at home, I dismissed the incident. At the end of the day, I still believed Carol loved me and only me. If I had listened to my intuition, maybe I wouldn't be in prison now. But I was foolish and allowed Jacob and my wife to lull me into a false sense of security. 2 months after the merger, nothing seemed to have changed between Carol and me. I learned that the company that acquired us was a mid-sized software firm primarily dealing with government contracts. The acquisition allowed them to enter the commercial market. Jacob's father wasn't the owner of the company. His family's fortune came from the electrical wiring and tubing industry. However, Jacob's father sold the business when Jacob was still in college. I could say many unpleasant things about Jacob, but I couldn't accuse him of being incompetent. In fact, he did an excellent job merging the two companies and even convinced the board to keep our company's name because it had a better reputation. What I didn't know was that after completing the merger in 8 weeks, Jacob launched a full-scale effort to seduce my trusting wife. Just like in high school with Sandy, Jacob managed to win over Carol despite my warnings about him. Carol seemed mesmerized by him and frequently commented on how well he was doing his job. I kept warning her about Jacob, but she dismissed it as jealousy. 4 months after the transition, Carol announced she was pregnant. I was overjoyed. However, our intimacy had dwindled, from 3 times a week to once every 2 weeks. I attributed it to her pregnancy. Then, our shared meals stopped, and eventually, Carol stopped going to work with me altogether. The breaking point came one morning when Carol stopped me before I left for work. I was a bit surprised to find Carol still at home since she had recently been leaving at least an hour earlier than me. "Michael, we need to talk," she said, motioning for me to sit on the couch. I sat down as she asked, confused about what could be so important that we had to discuss it early in the morning. What Carol told me shook my entire world. "I'm so sorry to have to tell you this," Carol began, her eyes cold and unyielding, "but I've fallen in love with Jacob, and he's fallen in love with me." I stared at her for a long time, studying her face. What struck me most was that she didn't show the slightest bit of remorse. Finally, I exploded. "Are you insane? I warned you. Jacob is an opportunist, and he's been trying to drive us apart. I can't believe you've fallen completely for his lies. He's no saint, Carol. Carol blushed slightly. He's a kind man, and he understands me. That's something you never did. I felt my soul shatter with every word she spoke. In desperation, I clung to something that I hoped would bring her back to reason. What about our unborn child? I asked quietly. Doesn't that mean anything to you? The baby isn't yours, Carol said with a forced smile. I was stunned by her declaration. That's a lie. That can't be true. I protested. We hadn't been intimate for 2 weeks when I got pregnant, Carol explained. At that moment, I lost control of my rage. You're lying. You slept with that piece of, this is my body, and I can do whatever I want with it, she screamed. Devastation doesn't even begin to describe what I felt. But my father had once advised me never to let a woman see how deeply she had hurt me. Maintaining my composure was the hardest thing I've ever done, but somehow, I managed to contain myself and smile. You say Jacob understands you in a way I never did, I said with a forced laugh. You're right. He understands that you're gullible and naive. God, you're so foolish. But you know what? You two deserve each other. He's a piece of garbage, and you're, Michael. Carol yelled. No, this won't happen again, I said calmly. But for the record, I'm not moving out of this house. We'll see, Carol said as she turned and headed to the bedroom. What a nightmare I was living in. Discovering that my loving wife had been cheating on me with Jacob all this time was too much to bear. I wanted to hit her, but I just couldn't bring myself to hurt a woman. Jacob, on the other hand, left me with no doubts. I cried all the way to work, but eventually, I pulled myself together. Well, that's a total lie, I was consumed with pure rage the entire way there. I decided I would confront Jacob and beat him up, though not necessarily in that order. I crossed paths with Jacob as he walked through the company's front doors. He didn't look alarmed to see me, instead, he smiled. It crossed my mind that it would be typical of Carol to drop her little bombshell without consulting Jacob. She had always been very independent. Jacob, on the other hand, likely had no intention of telling me about the baby until after it was born. Then, he would take my wife and newborn child at the same time. That would be his final victory over me. Rage consumed me as I approached him, and he continued to smile. In that moment, I exploded. I punched him in the nose, then in the mouth. I landed 2 hard hits to his groin, and as he began to fall, I finished him off with an uppercut. I left him writhing in pain near the front door as security guards rushed to his aid. Later, I learned that he lost 3 teeth and suffered a broken nose. I didn't come out of it unscathed either, I broke 2 fingers on my left hand. I walked to the common area and started packing up all my personal belongings and documents. Kimberly saw me and looked concerned and scared. What happened? She asked with genuine worry. Jacob slept with my wife behind my back, and now she's leaving me for him. I just gave him a beating, so I guess I'm fired. And if I'm not, I'll resign, I explained. The rest of my team stood in shock as they heard what had happened. Not only were they upset with me, but they were also very worried about their own performance. I reassured them as best I could, but I wasn't expecting what would happen so soon afterward. Once I was handcuffed, I asked Kimberly if she could collect the rest of my belongings and bring them to my house. After they took my photo, fingerprinted me, and handed me paper towels to dry my fingers, I was allowed to make a call. However, I didn't know whom to call. My parents were on a cruise and lived 2,000 miles away in San Diego, while I lived in Nashville. I certainly wasn't going to call Carol. Finally, I decided to call Kimberly. Maybe she could help me find a lawyer. However, when I called the receptionist, she told me Kimberly had already left for the day. After that, I didn't know what to do, so I sat in my cell, either fuming or wondering how I could get my wife back. One thought kept tormenting me: How could Carol betray me in such a cold and cruel way? Then, the thought of revenge overshadowed everything else. As the day dragged on and I languished in jail, I began to realize that Jacob already had a plan in place, while mine was only beginning. I was sure Jacob hadn't expected the beating he received today, but I was also convinced he anticipated I would attack him as soon as I discovered his betrayal, just not at a time and place of his choosing. Around 4 p.m., I was taken before the judge to face the charges. Since I didn't have a lawyer, I was assigned a public defender. To my horror, he looked like a teenager with acne problems. Not only did my lawyer look like a kid, but he also seemed to know nothing about me or my case. He quickly tried to skim through the file as the judge grew impatient. "Counselor," the judge barked, "is your client pleading guilty or not guilty?" The young lawyer looked at me like a deer caught in headlights. So, I stepped in and firmly declared, "Not guilty." "Thank God," the judge replied. "Bail is set at 25,000 pesos, cash or check." I didn't have much cash or blank checks with me, so I looked at the judge and said, "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I don't have that kind of money on hand." "Is there a way to contact a bail bondsman?" "My clerk will assist you with that and notify you once your trial date is set," the judge replied. But before the next case was called, I heard a voice behind me. "I'll pay his bail," Kimberly said, waving a checkbook. I was stunned to see her in the courtroom and deeply moved that she cared enough to come and help me. "I'll pay you back as soon as I can withdraw some money," I assured her, looking at my swollen hand. "This hurts a lot," I added, "but in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing compared to the pain of Carol's betrayal." "Anyway, boss," Kimberly said, looking me in the eyes, "I think your wife is a fool. She made a huge mistake choosing Jacob over you." "Thank you, that's very kind of you," I replied, smiling at my administrative assistant. At that moment, a young man approached me. "Are you Michael Arnold?" he asked. When I said yes, he handed me an envelope and said, "You've been served." I shouldn't have been surprised, but the speed at which I was served left no doubt that Jacob and Carol had been planning this for a long time. It was just another blow to my heart. "Let's get something to eat after I withdraw some money from the ATM, I said wearily. However, when I tried to access my account, my request was denied. I called the bank, and they informed me that all my accounts had been frozen. "This will remain in effect until the court lifts the freeze," they explained. "I now know you can petition the court to lift a full freeze on your assets, but I didn't know that at the time. I also discovered that my savings account was frozen, and my credit cards had been cancelled. A quick check of my wallet revealed I had 126 pesos plus a 100 peso bill hidden in one of the folds. Apparently, Carol and Jacob had frozen all my money. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I said to Kimberly, "At least I can buy you dinner." "No, that's not necessary," Kimberly protested. "Come to my house, and I'll cook dinner for you." I had to admit, I liked Kimberly's suggestion. It didn't make sense to spend the little money I had left on a meal out. We stopped by the office to pick up my car, and I followed Kimberly to her apartment. I couldn't believe how much this woman was helping me. I mean, she was just a coworker. I promised myself I would pay her back every last cent, and more, as soon as I could sort out my finances. During dinner, I felt utterly defeated, not just by Carol's betrayal but also because my 2 fingers were throbbing in pain. I had iced them as soon as I arrived at Kimberly's house, but they still hurt. Seeing me wince, Kimberly finally brought out a bottle of painkillers she had left over from a root canal. I took one, and within half an hour, the pain subsided significantly. "I still can't believe what they've done to me," I complained. "I hope Carol realizes her mistake soon because this is definitely going to come back to her like a boomerang. But someday, I'll make those 2 pay for what they've done." "Mr. Arnold," Kimberly said softly. "Please, call me Michael," I insisted. "I'm not your boss anymore. Besides, what you did for me today makes you a very good friend." Kimberly smiled. "Michael, My mom cheated on my dad and left him for another man. I had to live with her, and I hated every minute of it. Her lover was an idiot, just like Jacob. He never married my mom, but they lived together for 10 years before he left her for someone younger. My dad was bitter and spent years trying to get revenge on my mom. He was jailed multiple times, and in the end, he died broken. He told me before he passed that he deeply regretted letting my mom's betrayal destroy his life. He wished he could have just moved on and forgotten her. Today, my mom lives alone in a nursing home, struggling with respiratory issues from years of smoking. I visit her once a week, though I still don't like her. And every week, I have to listen to her regret leaving my dad. So, please, don't waste your life seeking revenge. I told her she was probably right. However, in that moment, I had no intention of letting those traitors get away with it. My anger still bubbled beneath the surface, and I wanted my pound of flesh. After helping Kimberly wash the dishes, I told her I needed to find a cheap motel. Her reaction was immediate. "No, you don't have to do that. You can stay here," she said. "I have a guest room, and you're welcome to use it." "Kimberly, you've been the only ray of sunshine in the dark hole my life has become." "I can't keep imposing on you," I replied. "First of all, it's not an imposition," she insisted. "And besides, if you stay here, I can go to work tomorrow and find out what's really going on." Once again, Kimberly made much more sense than I did, so I accepted her invitation. The next morning, around mid-morning, Kimberly called me to let me know I had officially been fired. She then instructed me to turn on her computer and write an email to HR, directing them to send my final paycheck to her address. Shirley, the head of HR, wasn't sure if the company was obligated to pay out my unused vacation and sick days, but Kimberly suggested I mention it in the letter anyway. "But the courts froze all my money," I pointed out. Shirley explained that the court order only applied to my bank accounts. "So send the letter quickly before Jacob or Carol realize what you're doing," Kimberly advised. I did as Kimberly suggested and received a fax confirming I'd get a check in a few days for 4,255 pesos. The fax also stated that they would need to review state law to determine if the company was required to pay for unused vacation or sick days. It turned out they weren't, but still, getting almost 5,000 pesos was a major win. When Kimberly came home, she told me Jacob hadn't been in that day, but Carol had, and she was furious with me for ruining her boyfriend. For some reason, Kimberly and I found this amusing. I decided to stay at Kimberly's place until I received my check. During that time, I worked on updating my resume and actively began job hunting. I quickly discovered that Jacob and Carol had blacklisted me. Since I worked in cybersecurity, no one wanted to take the risk of hiring someone with a pending criminal charge. When my check finally arrived, I handed it to Kimberly, and she deposited it into her account. I didn't want to risk opening a new account only to have it frozen as well. When I told Kimberly that I would stop bothering her and find my own apartment, she got upset. Kimberly pointed out that I probably couldn't even rent a doghouse without a bank account. Moreover, if they checked my credit score, it would surely show that I was in financial trouble. "Please, just stay here until you find a new job," she begged. "In the meantime, you can focus on finding a lawyer." In the end, I agreed. The lawyer I hired helped me after I paid a 2,000 peso fee. It was money well spent because he went straight to court to petition for access to a reasonable amount of funds from our checking and savings accounts. The court allowed me to withdraw enough to maintain a minimal lifestyle, which, of course, included paying my lawyer. I had been staying at Kimberly's apartment for 8 days when I decided it was time to leave. I found an apartment in her complex and paid the required deposit. That Saturday, Kimberly helped me shop for minimal furniture for my new home. I also took her out to dinner as I had promised. Kimberly wanted to go to Olive Garden, which I liked as well. While we were eating, I observed her more closely. She had the face of an angel, but the 50 extra pounds she carried detracted from her beauty. I could tell Kimberly was very self-conscious about her weight. Then, I had an idea, one I hoped wouldn't offend her. I thought about how to present it tactfully. "I just discovered there's a gym in our complex," I said casually. "I'd like to start using it, but I'd really like someone to go with me. Would you be interested?" "Do you really want to be seen with me?" she asked, gesturing to her sides to emphasize her extra weight. "Yes, I do," I said without hesitation. "Unless, of course, you don't want to be seen with a potential criminal," I added with a playful smile. My comment had the effect I hoped for. Kimberly truly didn't want to go to the gym because she felt self-conscious about her body, but she didn't want to offend me either. So, she agreed. We decided to go 4 times a week at 6 a.m., when no one else was ever there. After the first week, Kimberly realized she didn't have to worry about feeling embarrassed and started enjoying the sessions. I kept searching for a job, but no one in the cybersecurity field was interested in hiring me, at least not until my case was resolved. When speaking with my lawyer, I learned there was a high probability I would be found guilty of assault. However, he was careful not to tell me what to say or to lie. He did mention that losing control due to my boss and wife's infidelity could be considered a mitigating factor. And if I truly couldn't remember what had happened, the court would have to take that into account as well. On the day of my trial, Kimberly took the day off from work to accompany me. I deeply appreciated her support. When my lawyer learned that Judge Parker would be presiding, he convinced me to file a habeas corpus motion. This meant the judge, not a jury, would decide my case. My lawyer explained that this would please the judge and that Judge Parker despised cheaters. The prosecutor presented 3 witnesses to the alleged assault. They testified about what they saw and heard. My lawyer cross-examined them, getting each one to admit they didn't see how the fight started, didn't hear me threaten Jacob, and couldn't definitively say that Mr. Sanders didn't throw the first punch. Then they called Jacob to the stand. He told his version of events, painting it as an unprovoked attack. He emphasized that he didn't throw a single punch and listed his injuries in detail. My lawyer asked him about his relationship with my wife. Jacob lied, claiming they were just friends. When asked about the child my wife was expecting, he told the judge that as far as he knew, it was mine. As Jacob stepped down from the stand, he gave me a smug smile before returning to his seat. I was the only witness my lawyer called in my defense. All he did was ask me to describe what happened that day before the alleged attack and what I remembered of the incident. I explained how my wife had blindsided me that morning by telling me she was divorcing me to marry my boss. I was devastated, especially when she told me the child I thought was mine was actually Jacob's. I told the court that she had been the love of my life, but she discarded me like an old pair of shoes. I said I remembered seeing Jacob at the office door, smirking at me with disdain. After that, I lied and said I couldn't remember anything else until I was at my desk packing my things into a box. The prosecutor tried to trip me up about my recollection, repeatedly trying to pin me down to specific timelines and activities. The truth was, I had been so furious that morning that I had no sense of time. The more he pressed me, the more obvious it became that I was disoriented and didn't have a clear memory. Then he asked if I seriously expected the court to believe I conveniently couldn't remember anything about the attack. I replied that I had experienced a severe headache and flashes of light on my way to work, which was true. I repeated that all I remembered was Jacob smirking at me with disdain. He then asked if I knew for certain that the child my wife was expecting was Jacob's. I responded that I could only repeat what my wife had told me. Carol wasn't present in court because no one had bothered to subpoena her. My lawyer told me he thought my wife was a wild card he didn't want to risk. I assumed the prosecutor felt the same way. After I finished, the judge retired to his chambers to deliberate. He returned 10 minutes later. "It is clear to me," Judge Parker began, "that Mr. Arnold was betrayed in the most cowardly and shameful manner. I believe this shock to his nervous system resulted in severe mental distress. I find that Mr. Arnold was temporarily insane and, therefore, I declare him not guilty. This is outrageous." Jacob roared from his seat, only for Judge Parker to slam his gavel down with force, threatening to charge Jacob with contempt of court. Seeing Jacob flushed with anger gave me a small sense of satisfaction. His victory over me had just taken a hit. But my desire for revenge burned just as intensely. However, having avoided jail time, I knew I would have to postpone any thoughts of vengeance for the foreseeable future. Besides, I had no idea how to strike back at either of them. Jacob was waiting for me outside the courtroom. I toyed with the idea of provoking him into attacking me, but I wasn't sure how it would play out. Instead, I called over the bailiff. "He's supposed to stay at least 150 meters away from me, but he's blocking my exit," I said. The bailiff looked at Jacob and ordered him to move. Jacob shouted over his shoulder, "This isn't over. I'm going to sue you." That annoyed me, so I asked my lawyer, "Can he really sue me?" "Anyone can sue anyone," he replied with a smile. "But his case is weak. If you really want to undermine him, don't admit to anything except offering to cover his uncovered medical expenses." So that's exactly what I did. In a letter addressed to his office, I offered to pay for any medical costs not covered by his insurance. Jacob never responded or filed a lawsuit. Since my trial, it had been a little over 9 weeks since Carol gave me the devastating news. Although I was still filled with anger, the victory in court lifted my spirits a bit. So, I decided to invite Kimberly to dinner. I also had some exciting news to share with her. At this point, let me dispel any expectations that my story will follow the usual script. I've read many stories about husbands who were betrayed like me. These stories make it seem like every wronged husband starts their own business, becomes fabulously wealthy, and their ex-wife realizes she made a mistake by leaving him. That's not my story. I'm just an ordinary worker, a good worker, but just a worker. Kimberly and I agreed to meet at a small Italian restaurant. She had to work late that night because things weren't going smoothly in my old department. It wasn't anything serious, they were just adjusting to the fact that I was no longer there. When she walked in, she looked wonderful. Kimberly was still on the heavier side, but it was clear she had lost weight, and the dress she wore fit her beautifully. I stood up and kissed her on the cheek. "Wow, you look amazing. You've lost weight, haven't you?" Kimberly beamed. "Yes, I've lost 7 kilograms. Sorry I didn't notice earlier, but you're always in those baggy sweatshirts and track pants. Anyway, as I said, you look fantastic." The restaurant was small and cozy, the kind of place couples might choose for a date. But I didn't see it as a date, just a meeting between two close friends. "I asked you to have dinner with me tonight because I wanted to celebrate my court victory and share some news with you. I got a job." "That's wonderful," Kimberly said, smiling brightly. "Who will you be working for?" "Sable Security, in Jacksonville, Florida," I replied. "I didn't know they had an office here," Kimberly said, a bit concerned. "They don't," I admitted. "I'll have to move to Jacksonville." I was completely taken aback when the light in Kimberly's eyes dimmed, and tears started streaming down her face. "I thought you'd be happy for me," I said, confused. "I am happy you found a job," Kimberly said through her tears. "But you'll be 900 kilometers away." "Kimberly, do you remember how you told me not to let my wife's betrayal consume me with hatred?" She nodded. "Now I realize the only way I can do that is by putting some distance between Carol and me and letting time do the rest." "I understand," Kimberly said, wiping her eyes. "I'll just miss you. I've really enjoyed having a friend." "Hey, I'm just a phone call away," I said, trying unsuccessfully to cheer her up. I was suddenly struck by the thought that Kimberly probably didn't have many friends, so I made another suggestion. "You could come visit me if you'd like. I don't know what Jacksonville has to offer, but I'll find out." "Do you really want me to visit you?" she asked. Of course, I replied quickly. Remember, I won't have any friends there either. When are you leaving? I'll start packing in about 45 days. But before that, I have a lot to do. I need to find a place to live, open a checking account at a local bank, take a polygraph test, get fingerprinted, and pass a drug test. I think it will take me at least 2 trips to get everything done. After that, her mood improved slightly, but I noticed Kimberly wasn't eating much. I figured she was still a bit upset. In fact, as the time for my departure grew closer, Kimberly seemed sadder every day. It felt like she was hoping for something more between us. I must admit, this confused me because I felt Kimberly could find someone much better than me. I spent my last night before leaving for my new job at Kimberly's apartment. She prepared a delicious dinner and topped it off with a chocolate cake that had the words, "I'll miss you," written on it. After helping her clean up, we watched TV until it was time to go to bed. I kissed her on the lips before heading to the guest room. Her breathing became uneven, and I could tell she was deeply moved, even though I hadn't done much of anything. When I was utterly exhausted, I held on to Kimberly as she sobbed. I was worried she might be hurt or upset, thinking I had taken advantage of her or something like that. "What's wrong, Kimberly?" I asked, almost panicking. "Did I hurt you?" "No," she said, leaning her head on me. "I'm just so happy. I've had experiences with 5 or 6 men before, but this is the first time I've made love. Thank you." We stayed like that for several long minutes before Kimberly got out of bed. She took 2 steps toward the door, then turned back to me, leaned in, and kissed me. "Would you sleep with me in my bed tonight?" she asked. I was more than happy to agree, not only because my own bed was completely soaked, but also because being in bed with Kimberly seemed like the perfect way to spend my last night in town. I've never seen a face so full of pleasure and tenderness as Kimberly's that night and the following morning. We showered together, and it was then that I realized Kimberly was 3/4 of the way to becoming a true enchantress. She was already far out of my league, but I knew I would treasure this night for the rest of my life. After breakfast, I checked my car one last time to make sure I had everything. Then I turned to Kimberly and kissed her. She responded with the most passionate kiss I'd ever received. Finally, it was time to leave. As the car pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Kimberly sitting on the curb, burying her face in her hands and crying desperately. I didn't want to leave her, but I knew it was for the best. I was still in love with Carol, and that made me a lost cause. It was funny, though, by that point, I no longer thought about revenge. All I had left was a deep sadness in my heart. Jacksonville was a fascinating city, but I didn't have much time to explore it. I threw myself into my new job, working long hours not just to stay busy, but also because it helped me forget about Carol. I kept in touch with Kimberly, and she always seemed so excited when we talked, and so sad when the conversations ended. It was through Kimberly that I heard the news I had dreaded. Carol and Jacob got married about a month after her divorce was finalized. I also learned that Carol had given birth to a baby girl. For some reason, this news didn't affect me as much as I thought it would. Maybe I was starting to heal from the pain and humiliation. It's true, I rarely have sleepless nights anymore. I also rarely wake up feeling depressed in the morning because Carol isn't in bed with me. Kimberly visited me for 4 days in March. Since we hadn't seen each other in a while, we were unsure about our relationship. Somehow, we avoided talking about it, and we didn't sleep together until the last 2 nights. When we finally did, it was almost as intense as the first time, only this time, I came prepared with protection. Maybe having 4 dozen was overly optimistic, but I ended up using 6 during those 2 nights. About a year later, I was told I could hire an administrative assistant for my team. Sable Security was much larger than my previous company. While my old company had 1 cybersecurity team, Sable had 6. Over that year, I had gone from being just a team member to leading one of those teams. Since the hiring decision was mine, I immediately called Kimberly. I barely had time to explain the job before she said she wanted it. When I met her at the airport, my breath caught. Just as I had predicted, she looked stunning. I watched as a man's head turned sharply as she stepped out of the passenger compartment. But all Kimberly wanted was to get to me. She threw herself into my arms and kissed me with a passion that nearly made my knees buckle. The plan was for Kimberly to stay with me until she found her own apartment. I thought it would take her just a week, but the search dragged on week after week. There seemed to be something wrong with every apartment she looked at. I didn't complain because Kimberly and I were sharing the same bed. It's funny, during the year and a half I spent in Jacksonville, I thought about Carol less and less, and once Kimberly showed up, I stopped thinking about her altogether. Still, I knew Kimberly would eventually move out, and I dreaded that day. 5 weeks later, I asked Kimberly about her apartment search, and she started crying. I was completely bewildered. I knew I'd upset her, but I had no idea why. "I'm sorry," I apologized. "Did I say something wrong? Do you want me to leave?" "No," she said timidly. "I'd like you to stay forever," I replied firmly. "But I know that someday you'll want to leave. I just need some time to prepare for it. I'd ask you to marry me, but you're too good for me." "No, I'm not," Kimberly protested. "I've loved you almost from the day I started working at SB. I'd marry you without hesitation. That day changed everything for us. We went out to buy rings and started planning our wedding. Even though I was terrified that Kimberly might eventually leave me for someone else, I was so in love with her that I had to take the risk. 6 months later, Kimberly and I were married. A year later, Kimberly gave birth to a baby boy we named Mickey. 18 months after that, we had a daughter named Charlotte. I've since risen through the ranks at Sable Security to the point where I now lead all 8 of their cybersecurity teams. Yes, we've added 2 more. Kimberly, on the other hand, decided to become a stay-at-home mom. It was around Christmas, 3 years later, that I was called into a meeting. At that meeting, I learned that Sable was planning to acquire SB Software Security. I was to be part of the team conducting due diligence before the acquisition was finalized. During the years Kimberly and I had been married, her mother passed away, and my parents retired and moved to Jacksonville to be closer to their grandchildren and me. They also doubled as babysitters. I planned to use the week-long trip for the acquisition as a mini-break and also took advantage of Kimberly's skills as an administrative assistant to help with the investigation. That way, I could bring Kimberly to work with me every day, introduce her to some of my colleagues, and sneak away for lunch together. During my week in Nashville, I learned 4 things. This location was SB's only facility for cybersecurity work. Jacob had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer, and Carol was the Senior Project Manager. Despite my animosity toward Jacob, I discovered he ran a tight ship. From my perspective, the entire operation was first class. SB was holding a Christmas party on Friday night, and I was expected to attend. Aside from the initial presentation my team gave to Jacob, I had no contact with him. I also didn't see Carol all week. However, everything changed at the Christmas party. The party was held in a ballroom at the Hilton DoubleTree in downtown Nashville. It was festively decorated, with tables around the perimeter of the dance floor and a small band in one corner playing soft carols and old classics. After dinner and speeches, there was to be dancing. There was also an open bar, which became increasingly popular as more people arrived. Jacob, Carol, and a few Sable executives decided to welcome our team. I wasn't thrilled about this. I wasn't sure how I'd react to seeing Jacob and Carol together. My fears were unfounded. Jacob, as I already knew, looked more or less the same, and Carol, though a little older, still looked good. Surprisingly, I felt nothing when they came over to greet us. "Michael, I'm glad you could join us tonight," Jacob said nervously. "I hope our past differences won't interfere with the acquisition." "Not on my part," I assured him. This is my beloved wife, Kimberly, I added, kissing her on the cheek. Jacob's smile faltered as he looked at Kimberly and then at me. Kimberly smiled slyly at Jacob. Don't you remember me, Jacob? I was Michael's administrative assistant when he worked for SB, but I upgraded to being his wife. It was a promotion for me. Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly, but he tried to recover his smile, though it didn't seem sincere. Of course, he said. It was so long ago. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you. Jacob moved on, but his eyes kept drifting toward Kimberly and me. Then Carol slipped up beside me. Michael, you look great, she said, taking my hand. And your wife is beautiful. I didn't know you had gotten married. We've been married for 7 years this March, Kimberly replied with a smile, wrapping her arm around mine. You both look great, you and Jacob, I responded. How's your daughter? Carol flinched at first but then smiled. She's doing very well. Tammy is in 2nd grade, and her brother, Jacob Jr., is in kindergarten. Do you have kids too? Kimberly answered, my junior is in daycare, and Charlotte is still at home with me. They're both doing great, thanks for asking. Carol walked away, and shortly after, Kimberly and I found our table. The food was excellent, and thankfully, the speeches were short. The CEO of Sable reassured everyone that there would be no layoffs for at least the next year and expressed his excitement about the merger. After dinner, the music started, and Kimberly and I took a few turns around the dance floor. I think today's younger generation has lost touch with the essence of dancing. Slow dancing with someone you love is such an intimate experience, it can bring two people together almost as much as making love. At some point in the evening, I felt someone tap my shoulder. When I turned around, I saw Carol standing there. Kimberly turned to see who it was and narrowed her eyes when she realized it was my ex-wife. Carol smiled sweetly at Kimberly. May I ask your husband for a dance? Kimberly looked at me, then smiled back at Carol. As long as you remember where to return him. I took Carol to the dance floor, and we danced in silence for a minute. Michael, I just want to apologize for what Jacob and I did to you back then, she said, genuine regret in her voice. You didn't deserve any of it. When I found out I was pregnant with Jacob's child, I knew we were over. I decided to end things quickly and simply. I didn't even think about how much I might hurt you. I shouldn't have let Jacob convince me to go scorched earth, that was completely inappropriate. I chuckled slightly. As they say, it's either water under the bridge or over the dam. It doesn't matter now. We've all moved on. Besides, in a way, I deserved it, I gave Jacob a beating. Clearly, I didn't do too much damage to his reproductive organs since you two had a second child. Carol let out a small laugh at that. We danced in silence for a while, and I decided it was time to bury the hatchet once and for all. Listen, Carol, I began hesitantly. I admit I was deeply hurt when you left me for Jacob. It took me months to come to terms with losing you. But now we're both happily married with kids. I've come to believe that this was how things were meant to be. Carol stifled a bitter laugh, and when I looked at her face, a tear was rolling down her cheek. Did I say something wrong? I asked. Carol shook her head. No, Michael, you didn't say anything wrong. It's not what you think. On the surface, everyone believes we're the perfect couple, and for the first year, I would have agreed. But Jacob is just a charming manipulator. He uses people and then discards them. I know he's cheated on me many times, but he's not as clever as he thinks. Every time I find out he's cheated, I cheat on him too. My jaw dropped, and Carol noticed, smiling. It's a way to live, I suppose, she said sadly. I should have left Jacob when I realized what he was really like. But I was too ashamed and too proud. Michael, I'm happy you found happiness, but I'll always regret leaving you. You and our children were the best thing that ever happened to me. We talked until the song ended. Carol then walked me back to my table and thanked Kimberly for letting her borrow me for a moment. As Kimberly and I danced our last dance of the evening, I realized her advice from years ago had been right. If I had refused to move on after Carol, it would have consumed me. I believe it's true what they say, when God closes one door, He opens another. Losing Carol devastated me, but then God allowed me to find Kimberly, and I can't even imagine my life without her. What were you and Carol talking about? Kimberly finally asked. Is she trying to get you back? I laughed and kissed her. As if she has a chance of doing that. Good, Kimberly said, resting her head on my shoulder. Just remember, I'm a jealous woman who loves only one man. I'll cut you off, you know, if you ever try to leave me. I only mention this because I heard their marriage isn't all sunshine and rainbows. Carol told me the same thing, I said with a nod. But I think they'll stay together for the kids. After they grow up, though, I wouldn't bet on the survival of that marriage. What a sad way to live, Kimberly said. Anyway, Carol told me something that I found amusing. I'm sure she didn't think it was funny, and I'm certain Jacob won't either when they get home tonight. What's that? Carol was standing behind her husband, and he didn't realize she was there. Jacob was watching you and said, Michael has won again.